Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the joint briefing from NAHT and NGA, Unpacking Governance and Employment Law. Welcome to the more than 260 of you that have joined us this evening, NAHT members and non-members alike, school governors, school business leaders, head teachers, variety of school leaders. Really excited to have you here this evening. We're joined by Paula Porter, who is the Director of Representation and Advice at NAHT, and Steve Edmonds, who is the Director of Advice and Guidance at NGA. My name is Natalie Pettifer. I'm one of the regional organisers here at NAHT, and I'm going to be facilitating this evening's event. So on this side of your screen, you'll see that lots of you have already been using the chat function, which is really good, introducing yourselves, saying hello to your colleagues. If you can continue to do so, and also perhaps comment on the events that unfold during the session. My colleague is on hand to help you if you have any technical issues. So if you are experiencing any problems, please let him know by typing in the chat function as well. The platform works best on Google Chrome, if you're finding that that's something which you might have to sort out quickly. Just a little bit of advice there. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a questions section. We've had some questions submitted already, which is really good, and some people have actually already been voting on them. So if you want to take a look at them and vote during the session, then the most popular questions will be put to the panel this evening. If the questions aren't on there that you would like to ask, please feel free to add them to the Ask a Question section. And when we come to that point, then hopefully we'll get through to them. Any that we don't manage to get through this evening will be fed back on to everybody who's registered for the event, and they'll also be fed into the policy team for inclusion in our frequently asked questions. So the hashtag for this evening is COVID school response. That's for any social media activity that you want to do around the event. How it's going to work is that we're going to hear first of all from Paula and then Steve. We'll be introducing a poll during the evening, which I'll explain when the time comes. We're going to have a couple of different sections. We're going to be looking at survey results, joint guidance and wellbeing specifically, and also then, as I said, going to the question and answer session as well. So hopefully that's going to cover everything about how the event's going to run. Also at the bottom of the screen, I'll just point out there's the banner which has got a link directly to the NAHT FAQs for schools and coronavirus. So as I said, my colleague who's doing the background work for this evening will also be putting links that are mentioned throughout the session up into the chat function. So please do look out for those. So welcome. Thank you again for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to Paula Porter.
Thank you, Natalie, and good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome Steve, and I'll extend my thanks to him for joining us this evening. NAHT work extremely closely with NGA and collaborate with them on a whole host of issues across education. We have many aligned positions, and as NGA's latest school governance survey shows, we know that governors and school leaders have many of the same key concerns in education right now as we do. As far as possible, NGA and NAHT work towards a common aim, with school leadership and governance most effective, both at the local and national level, when these different roles come together in a collegiate and supportive way, respecting the different roles and responsibilities that each play. Key areas of collaboration between the two organisations have included work on funding and Ofsted campaigns, as well as a number of joint pieces completed along with other stakeholders that we have developed to support leaders and governors during the pandemic. We will touch on some of those guidance documents in a little bit more detail later. I am sure that you will agree that now more than ever, it's important to reflect on the culture of wellbeing and the support in place for both leaders and staff. It's imperative to ensure that the requests and approach taken by governors do not inadvertently add to the enormous pressure that leaders are under. It's a real balance, and we recognise that, between getting the information required to hold leaders to account effectively, but without adding unnecessary pressures. Working within the legal team as I do, I realised how important it is for those governing and leading schools to understand the legal requirements with which they must comply. Our policy position calls for mandatory induction training for all governors. We believe this would provide a consistent training programme focusing on governors' responsibilities around legal compliance, which is an incredibly difficult and important area. Effective school leadership and retention and recruitment, again, an extremely hot topic that we will touch on later. We believe that this training would be a platform to link into diversity training and training around issues such as unconscious bias. Given the issues around school funding, we also believe that work should be undertaken to improve governors' understanding of the important role of the SBL. Given all the financial pressures exacerbated by ongoing COVID costs, it will be critical that governors maximise their use of the SBL's knowledge and expertise to really understand the funding situation and the impact that COVID is having. We will talk a little bit later in this session about the tremendous additional pressures that heads and schools are currently working under. But at the moment, I'd like to just hand over to Steve to talk about the very interesting and pertinent results of the NGA's recent survey of members, which really fits into the themes of our discussion for this evening. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Paula. Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be with you, and thank you for the opportunity to join you. I'd just like to echo what Paula said, actually, about the value of the relationship that we have with NAHT and all our professional partners. And it's really something that we see as being a model for the relationship that exists between school leaders and governing boards, a relationship that's based on trust and a mutual understanding of each other's role. And I think when it works well, it's a powerful and overwhelming force for good. So I'm very delighted to be with you today. I'm also delighted to be talking about this topic, really, and one of the most important aspects of school governance at any time, which is those responsibilities that we exercise as employers of staff, or the responsibilities that we have conferred on us as employers. Now, those responsibilities don't apply in exactly the same way in all types of schools, as you know. In multi-academy trusts, for example, the academy trust and the board of trustees will decide whether the extent to which they're delegated locally. But one thing is consistent, and that's after funding, almost all of the major concerns of respondents to our annual school governance survey, and 2020 is no different, touch on staffing, whether that's well-being, welfare, recruitment, retention, professional development, as being major concerns for governing boards too. And so it's absolutely important, as Paula said, that we recognise there is much room for improvement in the way that governance carries out these responsibilities. By the same token, and as I know you all acknowledge, it's absolutely crucial that those involved in working with governing boards and those who govern understand the role of governance as well, and the part that governance plays. So we all it's a collective effort. It's a team effort that we have here to create a better employment environment in schools, whether that's through improving job descriptions, appraisal processes, the structures within which senior leadership is fulfilled, and through to equality and equal opportunities, as Paul has mentioned. So we're absolutely committed as an organisation to emphasising this highly important function and shining a light on the practices as well. But at this time, more than any, as Paul has said, we feel there's a moral imperative and a duty really for us as an organisation that supports governing boards to lead the way on being exemplary and compassionate employers, because my goodness, this is the most pressurised environment I can ever recall schools operating in, and the people working in schools and leading schools have my utmost respect for what they do. And Paula mentioned that our annual survey. And I'd just like to sort of unpick some of these employment issues in our survey, which we carry out every year. 6,500 responses to this year's survey, which during this period is is quite incredible, really. And balancing the budget and staffing, certainly in the context of wellbeing and workload, are clearly the top two issues for governing boards. And if we were conducting this survey today, as well, when slightly changing the category, I think that whole school well-being would probably be the number one concern. It wouldn't just be for staff; it will be for the whole school community, the pupils as well, because of the context we're dealing with, the pressures that COVID have brought, whether they're cost-related, implementing control measures, the family issues and societal impact of COVID. All that rains down on schools, so I think whole school well-being really, and that culture of whole school well-being has to be promoted. And we see how we look after our people who work in schools through that lens and through that context. And that brings me on really to what the survey says about the challenges that boards face when it comes to attracting and retaining their best people in school. And the top line, one of the top lines here is that 2 in 5 boards have reported that they're finding it really, really difficult to attract people to leadership positions in their schools and to hold on to them. Now, that data isn't as forensic as some of the research that the NAHT, I know, has carried out recently, but it certainly supports that narrative that we really need to think about the way we are looking after school leaders and teachers if we are to deliver on our vision for pupils. And governing boards know that, and they are part of that commitment. And perhaps one of the most encouraging things about the survey, one of the most interesting and positive things, I think, is that it clearly shows that the things that matter most when it comes to recruiting and retaining staff are things that are within the board's sphere of influence. We know about the challenges of funding; they are acute, and the pay bill that's been created by the absolutely appropriate increases in teacher salaries is not being adequately funded, and our boards are concerned about that. But in terms of things that they do control more directly, the culture, the workplace culture, that is the thing that, according to our survey, that staff is most influential when it comes to recruiting and retaining staff, even more so than salaries, which kind of reinforces how important it is to take that learning and for boards to influence a positive workplace culture, a culture where appraisal is a force for good rather than something to be feared, where professional growth is encouraged, where different views are listened to, regardless of people's backgrounds, perspective, and roles in schools, and where that culture of compassion and understanding is actually modelled through the school from the top down, from the board. And those are recurring themes indeed in our survey. So just to sort of, I'm looking at the time now. I'm not sure how long I've had. Actually, I should have set my clock for this, but I was just I've got 5 minutes, so I've got plenty of time. I don't need to rattle through any quicker than I am anymore, which is good because it means I can expand on a few of those. Points, because our members have absolutely told us, as I said, in no uncertain terms, that they've been in awe of the leadership and that head teachers and senior executive leaders have shown during this period, but they are telling us loudly and clearly that they're concerned for the toll that it's taking on them. So what we are aiming to do as an organisation this year, and we'll talk about this more in the other segments, is to prioritise the welfare and well-being and the professional support for those leading schools really because we want to see that approach modelled down the organisation. And I think one of the most important things that governing boards can do at this time is to check on the welfare and the well-being of their school leaders, and actually give them permission to look after themselves, because that is one of the other recurring themes that we are getting from our surveys and from our feedback, that actually executive leaders continue to be under this immense pressure, supporting others to deal with the issues thrown up by the pandemic and all that goes with it. But who's checking on them? Who's checking that they're getting those basic requirements of sleep, eating, exercise, family time? And I think encouraging school leaders to look after themselves is, as I say, one of the most important things that governing boards can do right now. So through our own offer, through our own guidance, whether that's around recruitment, whether that's through appraisal, we are modelling this values-driven approach rather than looking at these issues through the lens of compliance and some really not strategic way of pursuing these issues through the lens of accountability and hard-edged accountability. So we've updated. So I'm more than happy, obviously, to expand on this later. But we've updated our guidance to complement our e-learning in this area. We're also looking very closely at our wellbeing offer in terms of how we help governing boards to assess wellbeing throughout their schools and trusts and create that positive culture. And all this feeds in really to the values-driven leadership narrative, which is measure what you value. And Paula said at the beginning that's something that some boards don't necessarily do, and some school leaders don't encourage their boards to do. But I think now really is the time more than any to reflect on what is the most important things about our schools and its people. And I think that's probably brought me to the end of that segment, Paula.
Thanks very much, Steve, for that. So before we move on to hearing about the joint guidance, which Steve was referring to at one point, I just want to use this opportunity. We're working in partnership, NAHT are working in partnership with ITV on a story about the National Tutoring Programme, the government funding to address the impact of learning on the COVID-19 school closures. So of the COVID-19 school closures. So what I'm going to do, at the bottom of your screen, hopefully you'll now be able to see a poll question appearing. I'm going to ask everybody who's attending this event to take part, if you could please, so we can get a good range of feedback here. The first question that will come up is, are you planning to use the National Tutoring Programme as part of your recovery plans this year? Yes or no, undecided. And then the second question, which will now be appearing underneath as well, is how far do you agree with the following statement? I'm confident that the National Tutoring Programme will be ready in time to support with recovery plans for this year. Do you strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, strongly agree, and don't know? So I'm going to leave those there for the next sort of 15 minutes or so. And there was an opportunity to get a captive audience to take part in this so that we can do some information gathering. And I'm going to hand back to Paula, who's going to be first of all speaking around the joint NAHT and NGA guidance. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, Natalie. Just to say, I want to echo Steve's sentiments entirely. I love the phrase that working together, NAHT and NGA are a force for good, and I'm going to steal that phrase, Steve, if you don't mind. Looking at that and examining it in perhaps a little bit more detail, the work we do, I'd like to consider the joint guidance, the most recent 2 joint guidance documents that have been put out, and the link should be in the chat to these documents. The first of those documents is what governing boards and school leaders should expect from each other. And it's a really useful guide because it really sets the parameters for those relationships. It's broken down into 4 sections. And we recommend, and I hope Steve agrees with this, that our members may find it useful to take this document to their governing body for formal adoption, alongside the new governance handbook, which has very recently, as you know, been updated, and competency framework document released by the Department of Education. Moving on to what I think is a very, very useful document is the performance management and appraisal. It's our professional advice, but it contains information on, amongst other things, performance management and appraisal. The DfE guidance for the full opening of schools continues to advise to use discretion and take pragmatic steps to adapt performance management and appraisal arrangements to take account of the current circumstances. The guidance makes clear that there should be no detriment to individuals, which really, as I said, I've echoed Steve's sentiment, but it really is underlined by the comments that Steve has taken about this pragmatic and flexible approach to leadership within schools and working together. In relation to pay progression, which, you know, we have lots and lots of questions about through our advice line, we continue to advise that schools should consider favourably those teachers and leaders eligible for pay progression for the academic year 19 to 20, so that those who've been unable to successfully complete their performance, and let's face it, it's almost been impossible to do that in such incredible circumstances, do not suffer a detriment. And that seems to be the overarching principle in relation to the advice that we're giving. Unfortunately, we do have to tackle restructuring and or redundancy in our guidance too. And now that schools are fully open, our joint view is that it is possible for institutions to fulfil consultation requirements related to restructuring and or redundancy. However, in these uncertain times, schools and governing boards should be particularly vigilant to ensure that no individual is disadvantaged through, for example, and particularly illness or COVID risk factors, or a requirement to self-isolate. And that staff wellbeing, as Steve has said, is very carefully considered and is at the top of the agenda. It remains essential to ensure that all requirements are fully met and that consultation periods are responsive to changes in local circumstances, which may change the situation and could result in an unfairness if they're not revisited and reconsidered in the current circumstances. Disciplinary capability and ill health procedures, again, given the full reopening of schools, this means that it may now be possible to meet the timeframes associated with a fair process for these procedures. Many routine employment meetings can easily be conducted remotely. However, the more serious, where a job is at risk, meetings should be, in my view and in our view, contained within the joint guidance face-to-face. And we are finding that this can be accommodated, and our regional officers are being called upon to attend those meetings. And we, of course, have to make sure that the premises where the hearing is taking place is COVID safe, but in the main we have been finding that is happening and the hearings can go ahead. We effectively, in this guidance document, the joint guidance document, are encouraging governors and leaders to be pragmatic and understanding. And I'll use the word that Steve used, which I think is really important, and I hope comes through from both of us this evening in our presentations, and that's compassionate in the circumstances that we currently find ourselves in. Steve, would you like to comment on?
Thank you, Paula. Yes, because I think that the joint guidance on how professional matters are managed and conducted in these very different times, I think is a crucial piece and a crucial contribution. I was very pleased to have the opportunity to work with Ian Hartwright and others on putting it together. And you've given and set out those underlying messages that are in that guidance very clearly, and the key messages of pragmatism, flexibility, and compassion for others. And we are very consistent in terms of our specific advice, the advice that we give in context based on more knowledge of the actual situation with the NAHT. And we are encouraging that type of approach. Obviously, well-being is a two-way thing, and what one of some of the things we were encountering, certainly in the midst of the pandemic or the partial closures, were that processes had ground to a halt. Obviously, a very inconvenient but also emotionally distressing point for the participants and the people concerned, and we were also as mindful to understand the impact of processes grinding to a halt on the people involved and the institutions as we were of the implications of continuing them. So everything needs to be considered in the round when we're looking at these processes. And that is a very broad response, but it has to be values driven. And if I may up the ante in terms of the guidance here, because one of the other pieces that we're very proud to have produced in collaboration with NAHT was published last week, and it's called Being Strategic, a guide for governing boards and school leaders. And it really does emphasize a values-driven approach to school strategy and monitoring school performance that we hope trickles down into processes like appraisal, because generally speaking, in all times, we are very keen to emphasize appraisal as a force for good. And I know there's so much concern about targets and objectives not being met during it, because of reasons outside of people's control. But we think there's a more fundamental issue than that, and that is actually a process that's built so much on hard-edged accountability that it fails to recognise what it's there to achieve on behalf of pupils. So I think that needs to be recognised too.
Thank you. Okay, so we've had people asking for a link to that document, actually, Steve.
Indeed, I'll make that happen. Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. And hopefully you've seen the links have come up in the chat regarding the joint guidance as well that has been discussed. Actually, one of the most popular questions that was submitted ahead of this evening, which had 14 votes, was from Janet Dinsmore, asking what's the best way of approaching performance management for governors and head teachers as a result of the pandemic. Some targets set last year may have been impossible to achieve, and setting new ones is difficult as there's so much that's potentially unknown. How does this affect pay progression? So hopefully, Janet and others who voted on that, you do feel that has actually been addressed in the discussion so far. What I will do is, before we move on to the next section on wellbeing, if I just bring your attention to the next question down the list, and do please feel free to keep submitting questions and having a look what's there, and also to take part in the polls while this is going on. And if you miss anything, or if you think there's something that one of your colleagues might be interested in looking at, they can still register and watch the playback that will be available straight after this evening's event as well. But the next question on the list of submitted questions has got 11 votes. This is from Jill Robertson. And Jill asks, how are primary schools expected to deliver a full remote education alongside face-to-face teaching and covering other colleagues who are actually sick?
I'm happy to take that question if it helps. Well, we now know that the government are using the temporary continuity direction, which obliges schools to provide remote learning. The NAHT felt that the use of this legislation was completely unnecessary, and effectively we have treated it as a hostile act. It causes immense logistical problems, and we completely accept that. The only light at the end of the tunnel is that the guidance is really quite ambiguous, And if you look at it and look at our response on the FAQs, it sets out our interpretation of that requirement. And you will see that there is no obligation for live streaming to take place. The guidance refers to videos being used. It refers to other sources being used, such as Oakwood Academy and another provider. So there is in the guidance a way around this, because of course it is such a burdensome requirement. We also have the additional issue of, on the daily status form, there being included questions about remote learning and what has been provided by that particular school. So we're pushing back on that too with the DFE, because we don't want that to be misused in any way. But there are ways around it, and I would urge you to consider the details that we have included in our guidance, in our FAQs, which sets that out, because at first blush it looks particularly onerous, but there are other ways that that can be dealt with in our view.
Yeah.
Thank you. Steve?
If I just may come in now, and not a great deal to add to what Paula has said, other than that NGA agreed that, you know, the directive was, you know, is a lack of confidence and trust shown in schools, which is really tone deaf in the current climate. But governing boards don't have to behave like the government. They don't have to show that lack of confidence or trust in school leaders. So again, we advocate that collaborative process, where it's really important for boards to meet their core functions and their strategic responsibilities, all the reasons that they govern for, to understand the school's approach to supporting all pupils who will need this support in the circumstances, but then obviously work with their schools to understand how their staff and teams are being supported in their context to deliver that, using the professional advice that's available to them that Paula mentioned. So we would certainly, we're certainly not sort of mandating or advocating providing governing boards with very strict and specific questions or narrow parameters to assess how remote learning is being managed in their settings, because that is not showing the confidence and trust in our schools that we believe the government should have shown, you know, in the first place, or should be showing rather.
Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully that's answered Jill's question. I'm sure it has. So what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to give a little bit more time for the poll to be answered. If you haven't already done so, please do help us out with that. And we're going to move on to the next segment, which again, Paula will start with, which is on wellbeing. Thank you, Paula.
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider all of the extreme pressures that schools and leaders are under at the moment. And I will just talk about a couple of those, because I think it's important that we do focus on them. Particularly today, I heard that one member, when anticipating the restarting of the Ofsted inspection, described themselves as being terrified about this happening, which really resonated with me. We had the debacle of Ofsted providing misleading assurances that they were doing visits that didn't form part of the inspection process. And only when our General Secretary directed a legal challenge against that was there an admission that the visits are in fact light touch inspections under another name. Obviously, it won't result in schools being graded, but it's additional pressure on schools at the moment. We also have spot checks from the Health and Safety Executive, which have been confusing because they're using a third-party organisation to do the telephone checks. We know that in the majority of cases that most schools may receive a visit at some point, and perhaps advice on to how to improve. But we also know that there's a possibility that inspectors will identify more significant issues that lead to a notification contravention being issued, and this could give rise to a charging regime, which again the school would have to meet. So some real concerns, and particularly when you layer these all on top of the obligations of health and safety, the minefield of risk assessments, which have to be continually reviewed and renewed. I would point listeners to the Governance Handbook and our FAQs, which provide some excellent advice on this guidance, and we mustn't ever lose sight of the overall accountability for health and safety lies with the employer. However, it really is a collegiate effort, and every person in the school is responsible for health and safety, but it's a tremendous burden, and there just seems to be these layers of additional pressure which are occurring. And of course we have funding issues. We all, appreciate the extra pressure that the funding issues are bringing around COVID. Now the temporary continuity order requiring remote learning, which we've just discussed. Given that, it's absolutely will be no surprise to anyone that we are experiencing a substantial increase in calls to our helpline, and members are finding it very difficult to deal with all of the issues that they have to on a day-to-day basis. And it's certainly our view, and I hope that you share this, Steve, I know that you do actually, that consideration of the well-being of leaders and staff must be paramount. And we will put the evaluation tool, I know it was requested, but the NGA's evaluation tool for well-being in the messaging links. And I think, we have lots of support in place for our members, and the links will go in the chat. But Steve, if you'd like to talk around your view and the evaluation tool and how that works, that would be most helpful.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure there's a great deal I can add to what you've said about the pressures that the schools are under at the moment, and particularly those leading schools. And that we speak as one voice when it comes to the way the interim visits, the Ofsted's interim visits this term have been planned, rolled out, and approached. We weren't happy with that at all, and we've shared many platforms with NAHT and other professional associations to voice our concerns on your behalf. But just coming back to the broader point of well-being, I echo everything you say, and reinforcing those legal frameworks and legal duty of care that boards have to their school leaders and their staff is absolutely crucial. But what we really want to do as an organisation, more than anything right now, is to emphasise this as an issue of school culture and values, because one of the things that I think, if there's any positives to come out of this dreadful pandemic, it really is the deep humanity that we've seen in schools, and that calm and principled leadership that they've shown. Actually, school leaders have set a bar much higher than the ministers and the government has when it comes to supporting communities during this dreadful period. And so I think actually for governing boards, what we don't want to do is just to see this through the narrow lens, as I said earlier, as a compliance function. It's much more important to look beyond that and to reflect on the culture of well-being that exists in the school and trust. And if I could just be a little bit more specific there, what that actually means for boards and things that they can quite easily do is just start by encouraging their school and trust leaders to look after themselves, prioritise their own well-being and self-care, as I said earlier, then work with them to sort of provide those mechanisms for responding to specific pressure points and issues that may occur in their own context, in their own schools and trusts. How are we covering that? Where's the wider support coming from? and communicate that support is out there, and then make a commitment to monitoring it, even if it means pushing something else that is traditionally seen as a priority to the margins, and bringing wellbeing to the fore. That's conveyed throughout the document, the wellbeing evaluation tool. And when I sat down with Andy Mellor, who many of you will know, and we talked about putting this together, one of my first sort of thoughts was, oh no, not another evaluation tool for people to complete. What about governing board wellbeing? And can we really convey this properly through some sophisticated checklist? I think we have done, and what we tried to do is to really emphasize that this self-care for school leaders, and then giving themselves permission to look after themselves, can be modeled throughout an organization. And if that behavior is seen at the top and embraced at the top, then it is a much easier to embed throughout the organization. So we've got some very, very short, sharp, reflective questions, which I think trigger conversations and hopefully some sort of substantial activities arising from that. So do let us know what you think, and I hope that it's a useful addition to the set of resources on this topic.
Thank you. Is that anyone got anything to add on the topic of wellbeing? That's really good. I had a look at the wellbeing tool myself earlier, actually, when it came through. I'm school governor, and I actually, definitely intending to use that in my school. So I will be feeding back to you, Stephen. I don't know. I think you mentioned that possibly you'll be sharing a contact so that people can actually share feedback with you as well.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Yeah, always happy to hear from people. So I'll drop my email address into the chat, and we'll, by all means, contact me. Happy to discuss that with you.
Brilliant, thank you. So before we move on to our Q&A, we're just going to have a look at the poll result quickly. Thank you to those of you that have taken part. Quite interestingly, we've only got 16% of people that have responded saying that they are planning to use the National Tutoring Programme as part of their recovery plans for this year, but 40% are undecided. And then the question about agreeing or not with the statement, I'm confident that the National Tutoring Programme will be ready in time to support with recovery plans for this year. But actually got 60% nearly saying that they disagree. So they are not confident that the National Tutoring Programme will be ready. So yeah, that's quite telling. So thank you very much for taking part. As I said, that's going to be feeding into some partnership work that we're doing with ITV on that. So back to this evening's briefing and the questions that we've so far had coming in. We've got 9 questions, so you've still got time to submit some more. We've got about 10-15 minutes. We've addressed the question, which is still the most popular on the list, regarding performance management, and we've looked at the remote education as well. Interesting question here, and we talked about inspection lightly as well, but this is about full inspection, so it's not long now until January. What can be done to help Ofsted understand that resuming inspections would be very unhelpful at this point? That's a question from Sally Brisley, and we've had a comment on it from Deborah Dumouchon. Not only helpful, I believe they could be catastrophic in our fragile workforce. So I don't know who'd like to address that first. Anything further to say?
Well, I'll go. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. I think it's very difficult to add to what was said in the question, really. But I agree with that entirely. It is a huge concern, and we know that is the intention for inspections to resume in the spring. I know that on the behalf of NAHT members, that the organisation is working extremely hard to convey that to the policymakers and people in Ofsted. I mean, I'm not really well placed to say, whether or that will lead to a change of heart or a rethink. And of course, the situation with the pandemic, regrettably, is a big unknown at this stage, and things aren't looking good at the moment. But from a governance perspective and from NGA's perspective, all we would say and what we would advise our governing boards is that is to actually sort of stand alongside school leaders and in those situations, and indeed their schools, support them as best they can through the process, and that we are there for them as well to lobby on their behalf, and we want to hear about those experiences, and if the inspection isn't being delivered in a sort of compassion, in that, use that word again, compassionate and way that understands the context and what schools have been through and are going through, then clearly we must continue to lobby Ofsted to understand better the impact this is having on us.
Yeah, and absolutely, Steve. NAHT are really pressing this, and that, and our members certainly know, that we instigated legal action, not in relation to the inspections planned for next year, but to get clarity for our members in relation to the representations that were being made by Ofsted. So it's a difficult conversation. We are aware, as I said, today, the use of the phrase that an individual was terrified at that prospect really resonates, and we are hearing that from members, and we believe it's a complete unnecessary process at the current time and in the current circumstances, and we are pressing very hard against those inspections, and we will continue to do so and keep everyone updated.
Yeah, I think if I may come in again, this is this issue resonates right now, but we all know that it's the festering sore that is the accountability system, that drives people out of schools, and it is if this isn't now, we're seeing, as you say, this perfect storm of COVID and all the other pressures that brings. But if now we don't have a compelling case rather for remodeling our accountability system so that it's a positive one rather than one that drives people out of the profession, good people we need to support the next generation, then I don't know, if there'll ever be a time, really, having experienced what you've experienced now. And that's really important that governing boards, recognise that as well as school leaders working together.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And just to reiterate as well, really, what Paula was saying, there's obviously, we're in discussions with DFE, with ministers, around the issue of inspections returning in full in January. And if those aren't successful, we will definitely, as a union, be campaigning to delay that. And that will feed into our programme of online events as well after the half term. So if it comes to that, so just keep an eye out for that as well. But thank you very much for your comments, both of you, on that question. So the next question that is on the list I'm going to move down to is from Sandra Beaumont Pike. It's had 5 votes. And Sandra says, can schools bring back pregnant staff, teachers and support staff into school to do their work in light of the current COVID-19 situation and the government and HSE guidance? There seems to be a lack of clarity about the level of risk to pregnant staff.
Well, pregnancy is classified as clinically vulnerable and should be treated in that way, and would require enhanced risk assessments for anyone at risk in any risk groups, and that would include pregnant women. Employers must take steps to ensure that a school is COVID safe, but we would advocate an individual risk assessment for somebody who is classified as at risk. And there would be lots of individual features and factors taken into account. So it would be completely inappropriate for me to answer that generically. It relates to an individual and lots of features that would have to be taken into account and considered. But again, we do advocate a very pragmatic and flexible approach for those who are vulnerable and who are classified as vulnerable for whatever characteristic that is based upon. We must be very careful to ensure that those assessments do take into account all of the personal circumstances and characteristics of that individual.
Yeah. and there's very little I can add to that other than that NGA's guidance for governing boards on full reopening and monitoring full reopening and risk assessments includes those very important questions that Paul has just referred to about the extent to which vulnerable groups or people who are more vulnerable to COVID have been considered in those assessments, and what the what the contingencies and the control measures are that have been considered for those groups. And any compassionate exemplary employer would ask that basic question at a board meeting. I hope that's something that we are and I know is happening.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, there is a document on our website supporting staff on the return in relation to individuals who are vulnerable. And if we can get that in the chat, we will do. If not, it's on our website, and it's a very helpful document. I'm sure you'll find it helpful.
Thank you. I'm sure that will be being searched up as we speak.
Yeah.
So the next question, it's not necessarily written as a question, but I'm assuming that Jill Robertson and the 4 people that have voted on it want a little bit more clarification around funding for schools and increasing costs due to COVID expectations. Steve?
Okay, well, yeah, nothing I can say that's really that positive, to be honest, because we have the big funding issue, which we're all familiar with, and we all know the consequences of, which is that for years and years, school costs have outrun inflation. We have historic underfunding of schools, and we have a funding settlement, or as welcome as it is, over the next 3 years, that does put extra money into the system, but not nearly enough to make up for the underfunding over a decade. Throw into that the challenges of the financial pressures that created for schools and local authorities in the area of high needs, and then now we have this awful pandemic and the cost of keeping schools open and covering for staff and everything that goes with that. And we have this perfect storm. Now, in terms of the government's response to, or the department's response to additional costs incurred by COVID, we know that there is funding available. Another funding window, I think, is about to open, but it does not cover all of those costs, or take into account, for example, the rising cover costs. So it's not a good place for schools to be in. And again, it's just something that we need as collectively to marshal our forces to continue to lobby the government to recognise the issue that it actually is, and provide the resource that's needed going forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Steve. There has been some recent updated guidance published, and if we can get that in the link, again, Natalie and Mark, sorry to drop that in at the last minute, but it might be sensible if we can to have that in the chat. Obviously, school reserves will be considered and taken into account. It's almost a means testing for schools, effectively. It's clear that schools are unable to claim for loss of income, so renting out a room or anything like that isn't going to be covered. As Steve said, there's going to be real difficulty recovering any exceptional funding to ensure that schools are safe, COVID safe. You will know, I hope, that we had a crowdcast only last night on the subject of school funding, and that should be available, Natalie, to watch again for those that missed it. But the NAHT, this is one of our campaigning priorities, and we continue relentlessly to push the government and to push these issues on behalf of our members.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so crucial, this is, because it's, more than anything, as much as anything else, it's false economy, because if these costs will be absorbed in ways that that hit kids, and particularly disadvantaged kids. And I'm thinking about the impact, or the intended impact, of the catch-up funding. Well, that's going to be limited or diluted, isn't it, if schools are having to find the money that they're having to find, as you say, to make themselves safe, and so they're able to function at this time. So these are really fundamental points that we need to keep making.
And if you factor in all of the additional pressures that we've discussed, the layering of those additional pressures, and then a funding issue on top of that, financial issues and pressures, when schools are endeavouring to remain open and stay safe, and leaders are achieving that, to remove any potential for funding is really frustrating indeed. And that's why it is one of our campaigning priorities.
Very much so, thank you. And I'm sure that the link, a few people have been asking, but we would definitely be posting the link, if we can, shortly into the chat function to last night's webinar, as you mentioned. So thank you for that. I think we've got time for one last question, which is from Sandra Beaumont-Pike. And Sandra writes, we have 3 teachers on fixed term contracts ending August 2020. And these staff are coming up to 2 years in post. Would the school need to go into a redundancy situation in order to end these contracts, as it would mean an overall reduction in teaching staff? I know, Paula, we discussed this, and I think you're going to approach this a certain way.
Yeah, I was just a little bit concerned by this question when the date for the end of the contracts appears to have been and gone. So I will ignore the fact that there's reference to August 2020 in the question, and just really a very general answer. If we look at what fixed term contracts are, they are contracts that end at a specified time, but you cannot treat an employee who is on a fixed term contract less favourably than you would a permanent employee. However, it does end at a specified date, and if it is before 2 years, then the contract would just come to an end naturally. And from the circumstances that are described, and I'm being very careful and cautious with this, because whoever has asked this question really needs to seek advice from their HR provider and go back and look at the contracts extremely carefully, but just dealing with it very generally rather than specifically in relation to this issue. It would generally, from what has been described, not trigger a redundancy situation. But as I say, I would really urge caution, and I would go back to basics and look at the contracts, look at the period of employment, and consider the circumstances in this specific case and get advice before taking any action.
Thank you. Thanks, Paula. So as we said at the start of the session, there are a few questions which have been submitted which we haven't had time to address, but they will definitely be referred onto, and people who have registered for this evening's event will have a response to that, and they'll also be fed into our policy department, into our FAQs as well. So I'd just like to remind everybody, as we've referenced many documents which we've shared with you through the chat function. Hopefully I'm sure they will be very useful. We've also mentioned the FAQs, which are still at the bottom of your screen, the link there to the NAHT FAQs around coronavirus. Do refer to them if there is an issue that you want to seek guidance on. If you can't find your answer there, please don't hesitate to call the specialist advice line, and also from a governor's perspective, the NGA advice line. Each situation is different, although there are many experiences that people are sharing. Each situation needs that tailored advice, and we're always there to provide that for you. As I mentioned before as well at the start of this evening, there is going to be a recording. I know some people have lost some of the broadcasts throughout the event, so hopefully they'll be able to access that within a few minutes of the end of the session, and you can share that with your colleagues as well to let them know. We will be there's already a programme of events, and I've mentioned another one which may be in the running for after half term. So we're going to be offering some specialist briefings on for EDGE members, for school business leaders, and also for small schools. So keep an eye out on your inbox for what's coming in there. And just a final kind of call to action, if you are an NAHT member and you would be interested in offering your support to people in your branch as a rep, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Some people who have experienced the support of the union can really sort of sense that that's a way that you can give back. It's really good CPD and a really rewarding thing to do. So if you'd be interested in finding out more about becoming a rep, please contact us on organising@naht.org.uk. So I just want to thank you again for joining us this evening. Hopefully you found it a very helpful session. Before we leave, I want to say to all of you, I know some of you have actually got your half term starting next week. Those of you who've still got another week to go, you'll get there. Thank you so much for everything that you're continuing to do in keeping the schools going, keeping children in as much as you can with what we have to deal with. Doing a fantastic job. Make sure that they listen to all the advice about wellbeing and try and get some rest during that half term period. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Good night.
Good night.